Okie dokie, onto the urinary system. Of course, it's your kidneys. It is the ureters out of the kidneys to the bladder, and then from the bladder, the urethra out and such. So the kidneys are the workhorse. Everything else is just a storage or passageway. What do the kidneys do? Kidneys do quite a lot. They do regulate your ion levels, your sodium, your potassium, your calcium, and such. They regulate your blood pH. They aid in, they'll remove acid or they'll hold on to acid. They'll actually add bicarbonate and such. It regulates your blood volume, which then in turn regulates your blood pressure. It helps to maintain the appropriate proteins for the osmolarity and such. It will release calcitrol, which is an active form of vitamin D. And vitamin D helps you absorb calcium. It will release erythropoietin, which is the hormone that triggers red blood cell production. It will regulate your body's glucose levels. If you have way too much glucose, you will excrete glucose so that you don't overwhelm the system. And then it also gets rid of any wastes, any foreign substances that you might have. They are a pair. You have a pair of them. They're kidney bean shaped. They are behind the peritoneum, kind of right above your waistline, and the right one is a little bit lower than the left because of the liver taking up space. Make a fist. It's about the size of your fist is what they look like and such. They have a concave border that is known as the hilus. That's where all of the vessels and everything go in and out, where the ureter goes in and out and such, is that concaved area, the hilus. There's 3 layers around a kidney. The innermost, which is the outside of the kidney, is the capsule. And then on top of that is a layer of fat. And then on top of that is this fascia, which helps anchor the kidney in place. So your kidneys, they receive about a quarter of every time your heart beats, they receive about 25%, a quarter of the total blood flow out of that and such. And you'll have a renal artery, a right and left renal artery branching off of the aorta, and then you'll get these segmental arteries and such, and that'll lead to another set, arcuate arteries, and you get to these cortical radiate arteries, and you get to these afferent arterioles, and then that leads to the afferent arterioles go into the capillary structure itself, which is called a glomerulus. Coming out of the glomerulus is an efferent arteriole. So the afferent goes in, then you have the glomerulus, then you have an efferent, and the afferent's lumen is larger than the efferent, so you have a pressure difference, and that creates a higher pressure within the glomerulus, which then enables pressure filtration. Once you leave and you're in the efferent arteriole, it goes into a capillary system, and this capillary system wraps around the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, and then also around the loop of Henle as well. The area just around, you have another capillary bed around the loop and juxtaglomerular nephrons, and that's known as the vasa recta. All of that collects back up from a cortical radiate vein, an arcuate vein, a segmental vein, to a renal vein, back to the vena cava, back to the heart. There's a nerve plexus which feeds into the nerves and such, and it's just sympathetic. That's really only kind of a nerve impulse that will go to the kidneys and such. The kidney is really run with hormones, really the big thing. The functional unit of the kidney is called the nephron. You have about 1 million nephrons in your kidneys and such. They do 3 things. They filter the blood, they reabsorb the filtrate, and then they secrete the things that they couldn't filter, if you will. So collectively, what's produced, the filtrate that then leaves the nephron, is collected in the calyces, which then go into the ureters, which then go into the bladder. That's the urine and such. When you're thinking of nephrons, you have 2 types, short loops and long loops. The short loops stay within the cortex area with a little bit of penetration into the medulla. That's your cortical nephrons. 90% of your nephrons are cortical nephrons. Then you'll have another set which have a very long loop, and that long loop goes down into the medulla. Those are your juxtamedullary and such. The juxtamedullaries are really going to help with fluid balance in the body. How it works, that glomerulus is the filter and such. When you think of this glomerulus, it has an inner lining, a single simple squamous lining, this endothelium, and it has holes, pores. That's just a fenestrated capillary. And they have different layers with different sizes. So you have this endothelium layer with these large holes. Then you have a basal lamina layer with a medium-sized hole. And then you have this membrane, this visceral layer of the capsule. And I call it Bowman's capsule and such, a nephron capsule or whatever you want to call it, glomerular capsule. And the epithelium making up that visceral layer are these special cells called podocytes. And then they cover the basement layer, and it creates little bitty holes and such, these filtration slits. So you have these three layers, and the holes, the pores, they get smaller and smaller. So this is how you get this filtration to occur. So, and you don't let the large things out. You keep the blood proteins, and you keep the red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets in the blood's the circulatory system, but you let the fluids and anything dissolved in the fluids up into small proteins into the capsule. When you're looking at the rest of the nephron, the tubes, the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop, and then the distal, you have a single layer, and these in the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal, they are simple cuboidal. And when you get into the loop, they're simple squamous and such and all. In the distal convoluted tubule and in the collecting tubules and such, there's cells there that make up the tubules, and they're called principal cells. And they are affected by antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone affects them by when ADH is present, they don't express these proteins called porins. So you have less porins, so you have less water flowing into. Well, let me think about this. All right, how it works with the antidiuretic hormone. I had to think a minute, I had to sit back and think. Those principal cells will express this protein, which is basically a hole, a pore. And when ADH is present, then they will express those pores, and the water that is in the tube can leave the tube. So if the water is leaving the tube and going back into the interstitial space, you have less fluid in the filtrate, which means less urine production. When ADH levels are not there, when ADH levels are low or non-existent, then they don't express those pore proteins, and so the water stays in the tube, and so the amount of urine produced goes up, excessive diuresis. So I had to think about it, but I got it right that time. You do have some intercalated cells, and those affect the pH by excreting protons. If you excrete protons, you're taking the acid from the blood and putting it into the urine. So you're actually raising the pH of the blood up. In the loop, and you really need to be looking at a picture of a nephron to see this, but you go from the capsule to the proximal convoluted tubule, then you get to the loop, and you have a descending arm, which means it's going down. You have the loop, and then it turns and goes back up, and that's the ascending arm. And on the ascending arm, it goes up, and it will actually rub up against the afferent arteriole. They'll kind of bump up against each other. Where they make contact, that is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. That's how the kidney is measuring filtrate production. So it's measuring blood pressure and then filtrate production by the contact of the cells of those two different vessels, if you will. And then that will affect the smooth muscle fibers of the afferent and the efferent arteriole, and it'll trigger or increase or decrease the release of the renin, which starts that RAS system.